Hello, my name's Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I am continuing with my discussion on why I do not think the CIA was involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, first of all, understand that many people have made claims of being the ones who assassinated President Kennedy. These are hoaxes, they're false claims, they don't have any credibility to it. Now, today I'm going to um, quickly discuss the connection between the CIA and the mafia. That's the alleged conspiracy between the CIA and the mafia in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. This has been discredited. Uh, I'm putting a disclaimer out there. I am not a member of organized crime. I don't know anybody in organized crime. I have no affiliation with organized crime, and I do not support any. Uh, I don't glorify or support organized crime. This video I'm doing is not to actually glorify organized crime. I talk about American presidents, and as we all know, I'm talking about President John F. Kennedy. His presidency was eventually overshadowed by his assassination, and there have been all sorts of conspiracy theories about who assassinated the president. Of course, we know Lee Harvey Oswald, was the man who was caught, and eventually he was killed 2 days after by a man who is known to have mob connections. That's Jack Ruby, and it's the main reason why many have actually linked the mafia with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and also the CIA. So why is it that they say the CIA was involved? There's this theory out there that the CIA got the mafia to kill John F. Kennedy. Again, if the government had the head of our government, that's the president, killed, that would be known as a coup d'etat, right? In a coup d'etat, when you take out the head of the government, it's an overthrow, and it's to institute uh, the executioners. It's to establish them in government, and among the things they do is to legalize their presence, their existence, their takeover. They want to legalize it by abrogating the constitution that says their action was illegal. So they do away with our constitution. That was not done by the CIA or whatever government, ostensible government unit pulled it off, right? It wasn't done. But we still have the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution had the vice president. It was established that the vice president, President Lyndon B. Johnson, would be the one to succeed JFK in the event of an assassination. That was what happened. That was what occurred. There was no change in process. There was no change in government, right? The same government continued. There was continuity in government. So you can rule that out. I'll get into details later on. But let me quickly debunk the allegations that the CIA got the mafia to assassinate the president. Let me start off, with debunking the case of the mafia. I've done several videos saying why I didn't think the mafia assassinated the president. Again, I've talked ad nauseum about how the people at the top of the food chain of the mafia, they're intelligent men. They're running a business that they want to continue, and it will be orthothesis for them it will be suicidal for them to actually order the execution of the president of the United States, the most powerful man in America, in the world, and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's really the chief law enforcer. If you can see a prosecutor who goes out after the mafia, like Thomas Dewey, if you can see him as a law enforcer not to be trifled with, or at least the mafia doesn't want law enforcers, prosecutors like Thomas Dewey to be killed, as Lucky Luciano ordered. In fact, he had a mobster killed, a prominent mobster, that was Dutch Schultz, killed for attempting to assassinate Thomas Dewey, a law enforcer. You can tell that the commission would not want the chief law enforcer, the most powerful law enforcer. That's the president of the United States. He's the head of law enforcers. He's the commander in chief. Uh, they wouldn't want him killed because if their reason for not wanting Thomas Dewey or Rudy Giuliani killed was not to have a law enforcement crackdown, you can bet something bigger than a law enforcement crackdown would actually would occur with the assassination of with the mafia sanctioning the assassination of the president of the United States. That did not happen. So Carlos Marcello is, has been, pinpointed, has been pointed out as being the person, one of the mafia guys who was involved in the assassination. Carlos Marcello was the head of the Louisiana mob, and the Louisiana mob was not as powerful as the New York or the Chicago outfits, right? Those were part of the commission, the National Crime Syndicate that Lucky Luciano created. The Louisiana mafia, the New Orleans, stationed in New Orleans, apparently they're the first. They're the first mob outfit in America. They went back as far as 1860s, and they had direct ties with the Sicilian mafia. So they're respected, even though they're not amongst the most powerful, right? And they're not even officially part of the National Crime Syndicate, the commission which Lucky Luciano created, right, to sort of create that network of organized crime. So they acted independently. So it's possible, right? I've laid out my analysis that, well, the mafia followed what the commission uh, authorized, and people, mob bosses would not want to go against the commission. They followed the code of conduct strictly. But, well, New Orleans, the Louisiana outfit, they were independent. So Carlos Marcello, he was independent, so he could act independently. The claims, however, that he was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the president included Sam Giancana, who headed the Chicago outfit, which was part of the commission, and then a guy called Santo Trafficante. Santo Trafficante was head of the Florida and Cuban outfits, right? He was killed with Sam Giancana later on. And I guess to prevent the congressional investigations and hearings concerning the activities of the CIA and intelligence agencies in assassinations of foreign heads of states, including Fidel Castro, attempted assassination of Fidel Castro. In any event, it is alleged that Carlos Marcello himself uh, admitted to having Kennedy assassinated. Yeah, when he was in prison and had senile dementia. Later in his life, in the 80s, Carlos Marcello was actually formally diagnosed, when he was in a prison hospital with senile dementia. He actually thought he would see his medical attendants and nurses and start talking to them, and this was one of the times that he talked about celebrating and celebrating the assassination of JFK and how he had the JFK killed. But of course, he had senile dementia. He thought his medical attendants were actually part of the mafia, the mob. They were his crime associates. So he had senile dementia. And of course, his inmates, while he was in prison, later on in his life, claimed he confessed to them in a fit of rage that he had Kennedy assassinated. Again, those were signs of senile dementia. You can't trust, um, the comments or the statements of somebody who's been diagnosed with dementia or is erratic, right? So this is what happened, right? So that's not credible. And words, jailhouse confessions to inmates, to criminals, right, convicted criminals, are unreliable. right? So they're not credible statements. Those jailhouse confessions and things like that, they're actually set up by by crooked law enforcement. Right? So the inmates are lying. They're not credible. So you can't rely on such statements. So we can't rely on the statements of Carlos Marcello when he apparently had dementia. So that's one that rules that out. Um, Now, another reason why they point out Carlos Marcello is because of a guy called Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw is the only person who was ever went to trial for the assassination of President Kennedy, and it is the trial is the basis of the Oliver Stone movie JFK. I've seen it, and you can watch it. Oliver Stone's JFK, and where a New Orleans district attorney called Jim Garrison, he actually prosecuted Clay Shaw, who was acquitted. Clay Shaw was supposed to, his association with the CIA was exaggerated. He was just a part-time. He was not even an employee. He reported to the domestic, what was called the Domestic Contact Services. It's an agency that any American who's traveled abroad can voluntarily go and provide information to the CIA. And this was the extent of Clay Shaw's involvement with the CIA. He was not a CIA employee. He was actually a businessman, and he was a gay. He moved in gay circles, in New Orleans, and it was said that I think his relationship and with Lee Harvey Oswald and with Jack Ruby and Carlos Marcello was exaggerated. It was blown out of proportion. I think again, there's no credibility to this whatsoever. Clay Shaw was acquitted in Jim Garrison's prosecution. He was acquitted very fast, very expeditiously, and in fact, Clay Shaw subsequently filed a lawsuit against Jim Garrison. So again, there's no credibility whatsoever to the association, the relationship. Uh, the attempts to link the CIA again through Clay Shaw. They they again don't have any credibility, and they're unreasonable. So the CIA, that's a government, trying to soliciting the mafia, in this case in Carlos Marcello, to have the head of government executed would be, you know, it would be a setup. They would be setting up a crime head, a criminal. That's the government trying to frame or set up a criminal, and they'd have actual evidence against them that they committed a crime. Again, the heads of the mafia were the people at the head of the food chain, at the head of the pyramid. They're very intelligent. Yes, they're criminals, they're Machiavellian, but they're very intelligent. And they would understand that the government is trying to set them up to kill the head of government. And it would be the basis for the government to actually, the most powerful government in the world, to actually destroy the mafia, right? So they're not going to accede to such a conspiracy to assassinate the president of the United States. What if any ostensible CIA official approached the mafia or Carlos Marcello or Sam Giancana or Trafficante, it was most likely a mole. And I'm going to talk about these moles later on. So during the Cold War, the KGB and Soviet agencies successfully infiltrated the US government and the CIA. A mole or a sleeper cell or sleeper agent, that is an instance where an illegal intelligence agent, right? They're not acting under uh, government authority openly or under government cover. They are isolated. They're acting independently in the target country, and they're living like they are a citizen of that target country. They have a false identity, they assume a false identity, and they assimilate in the country. They're living their lives, they're working, and nobody knows. And they can become activated at some point. For a better understanding, if you watch a movie called No Way Out, I watched it a long time ago when I was a kid in Nigeria. No Way Out, it starred Kevin Costner, and Gene Hackman was in the movie as well. So Kevin Costner was an example of a mole, right? He was actually an officer I think in the Navy, in the military, but he looked like he was an American. He had assumed this false identity and he'd lived it, but he was actually he had infiltrated the U.S. government. He was really a Russian agent, and he grew up in America. They gave him a new identity and all that stuff. There are people, moles like that have infiltrated the U.S. government, the United States, from uh, from the Soviet Union. They were planted as moles. They are assumed this totally new false identity, and they live lives, perfect lives, and then they enter the U.S. government, and then they do what it is. They do their covert work, what they're supposed to do. So moles have been caught, but the idea in espionage, the idea is that you don't catch these spies. You only know of these spies when they failed, right? When something's gone wrong, when it's been discovered. For the most part, there are many instances that moles were never discovered, and they continue to operate successfully. So if anyone in the government, in the CIA, ostensibly, allegedly uh, approached any of these mafia bosses, it would be a mole. Other than the government trying to set the mafia up, it would be a mole, one of these moles who successfully escaped being discovered. And this is something it was probable, it's not improbable that it occurred. That even Lee Harvey Oswald may have been approached by a mole, may have been controlled by a mole. I'm going to do subsequent videos and talk more about some of the activities which are in the public domain that the CIA was engaged in, and why they may have had a reason um, uh, to cover up their activities. But they didn't. But the government itself, the CIA agency, did not have JFK assassinated. If there was anybody, which they haven't discovered till now, right? It would have been a mole, right? It would have been a mole. There were moles that were caught, like a guy called Aldrich Ames. He was actually as high up. He was the head of the Soviet counterintelligence. So these moles, they were USSR spies from the USSR. They successfully infiltrated Western governments. Including the MI6. The MI6 is the spy agency equivalent of the US CIA. The MI6, of course, was older, much older than the CIA. The CIA was not started until 1947. Its predecessor was the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was part of the US military. Again, espionage is illegal, and but during the Cold War, uh, the two superpowers, the US and, of course, the USSR, and their respective allies. The US had the NATO, right? They had NATO, and the USSR had the Warsaw Pact. So these two intensified their espionage activities, and uh, the USSR was more successful in infiltrating the United States and the West with moles and sleeper agents. And I'll get into discussing some of these in a subsequent video. So this may have been if there's any probability or any possibility that anybody in the CIA approached or influenced anybody in the mafia to in a conspiracy to assassinate the U.S. president, it would have been a mole that did this. They successfully infiltrated the top echelon of U.S. government and Western governments. Um, a very notable person who was caught in the MI6 was a guy called Kim Philby. Kim Philby was part of what was called the Cambridge Five. Uh, in fact, one of the Cambridge Five was a guy called Anthony Blunt. He was never caught until much later on in his life, when the Cold War was over, I think. Um, he was a Sir Anthony Blunt. He was actually a cousin. He was a cousin of the Queen of England. He was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. I think it was a third cousin or so. And he worked in the government, at courts. He had an official position at court. He was a very famous professor, and he had a knighthood. And he was never caught until much, much later. And so you can imagine there are some moles in the U.S. government who were never caught. Again, uh, a guy called Angleton, right? James Angleton. His name was also Jesus, right? He was head of the counterintelligence units. He became paranoid that the CIA had been infiltrated, that the top level had been infiltrated with moles, right? In fact, it's funny that at some point his subordinates thought he himself was a mole and started investigating him. So there was this paranoia in the CIA, and in fact, I think even after Aldrich Ames was caught, there was indication that there were still moles there that they hadn't caught. Um, so Angleton was actually close to Kim Philby because Kim Philby, uh, at one point, had been stationed in Washington D.C. At one point, Kim Philby he was marked to become the head of the MI6. You can imagine becoming the director of the CIA, the head of the CIA, and he was actually a mole. So this may have been something that had happened. So the CIA, the intelligence outfits of the West, had been infiltrated, and what may have occurred was that a mole got to Oswald, manipulated Oswald, or when there indeed was another shooter, then a mole got to assassinate President Kennedy and got away with it. Again, a CIA director, James Woolsey, has claimed that he wrote a book, and he's claimed that the Soviets did assassinate JFK, and he believed that Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife were actually double agents. They uh, were working for the Soviets. Um, I'm going to do more videos and just talking about why I don't think the CIA was involved in the assassination of JFK. Again, it may have been infiltrated with moles. I'm going to talk more about these moles in subsequent videos. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, which I've been experiencing in Montgomery County, Maryland, where trumped up charges were filed against me to discredit me and to obstruct justice in an equal employment opportunity complaint and Office of Special Counsel complaint that I filed against the Department of Defense and Department of Navy rogue employees. And it is unfortunate that I'm talking about the abuses in government, and I'm actually experiencing and witnessing firsthand public corruption and abuses in our government. But our government works properly, and it can be corrected. And the idea is, what needs to be done is to not to cover up for rogue federal government employees, but to thoroughly investigate and not rubber stamp the activities or actions of our rogue employees, no matter how high up in the chain they are. You know, they end up just impugning our government, and they become, vulnerable to foreign agents. We don't know if these people are moles, right? They become vulnerable to foreign agents, to manipulation. And one of the challenges we're having today, we don't have a communist scare anymore. We don't have a communist threat, but we do have a nihilistic threat. People who don't believe in anything. Many people who ended up working for foreign governments, for the USSR, it wasn't an ideological thing they had, like Aldrich Ames, uh, you know, uh, who had been a CIA, high up in the CIA. He did it for money, and he was nihilistic. Like somebody who's a nihilistic person, they don't believe in authority, respecting authority. They don't care. They don't have any belief, in values and things like that. So this is a threat we now have in the U.S. government. So many people are nihilistic, right? They don't have any beliefs, and so they don't believe in the integrity of our system. They're just self-interested, and they undermine our government, like these federal employees that I've reported. These people, especially nihilistic people, don't have any morals or any scruples. They have, and I reported these employees. They acted with, they demonstrated moral turpitude, and they shouldn't be a part of our government. In any event, I've said enough. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.